nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
Welcome to the Blackness podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. All right, before we get into the myth or any other conversation, I definitely want to take our time, as we've been doing here recently, to shout out our patrons. As some of you may know, I was formerly a producer of the show, The Last Dope Intellectual, that was co-hosted by Dr. Sharice Burton-Staley and Dr. Layla Brown. That show is no longer in effect, but one of the things that we did do was encourage people to come over to our Patreon who were once supporters of that show. One, I want to just say, shout out to Dr. CBS and Dr. Layla for having me down as a producer, and it was dope being on that show. And then I also want to shout out some of the people who crossed over to become supporters of our show, as well as just new people who signed up. So as I said last month, we wanted to start, naming our patrons and shouting them out on air. And I think it's been effective because we've definitely seen more people sign up, and we want to continue to encourage that. So we'll go ahead and name everybody here. So we got Eric Berkeley, shout out to you, Charles Holm, some of y'all's name I really can't say, Salsa, Sean Horner, I Am Clear, Michael Craig, Kevin Holmes, shout out to Ricky Bryan, always been a good supporter, and then Corn Pops. That's the man's name. I ain't calling that. That's what his name says on him. So shout out to all of y'all for jumping on. And again, for those who don't know, again, we not done a good job advertising it. We do have a Patreon. So please feel free to join. You can join as low as $1. The more the better. Obviously, this does take a lot of work. Just keeping it up every month, doing the research, reading the books. So anything helps. Keep this going. Hopefully soon we'll have shirts with myths on the back of them and the logo on the front. But again, just want to thank everybody who's been on so far. All right, so today's myth is an interesting one. We're really a part two, but I'll get to that later. But the myth, as you've seen on, whether you're looking on video or audio, or listening on audio, the myth is rooting for everybody black, and it's an extension of what was an episode we did last year, myth of trickle-down Blackness. So let me explain this. So, because we always get accused of things we didn't do. So let me explain this, at least so we're clear. So we're interviewing Femi Taiwo. He's an assistant professor at Georgetown University. He's a professor of philosophy. He just put out a book, Elite Capture: How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else. Now, he was previously he was on our show, and back in, I believe, January 2021, when he had wrote the essay Identity Politics and Elite Capture, as well as two other essays that we interviewed him about, one on deference politics, or elite capture and being in the room privilege, and then another one called The Empire Has No Clothes. So he basically took all three of those essays, just wrote a book about it, and expanded and connected those ideas. So it was dope to be there at the beginning when, and to talk to him about these separate essays that now have been a book or have become a book. So it just came out in A Market. He's had great press on it. It's been in the New York Times, The Nation, the New York Magazine, and so on and so forth. But anyway, the myth itself, rooting for everybody black, is an extension of the conversation we had with him on part one, which was the myth of trickle-down blackness. So rooting for everybody black is really just part two of the myth of trickle-down blackness. The myth of trickle-down blackness is the idea that you can concentrate a bunch of black people in the elite spaces, and their success will somehow trickle down to the rest of black people as a form of liberation. This project has failed, and listen to part one if you want to get a better idea, just the generalities of that, but this project doesn't work. What tends to happen is you just have black people in high spaces, black faces in high spaces, and that doesn't necessarily translate to the day-to-day struggles of most of us. So we get to see a black president, but that doesn't necessarily transform our day-to-day lives. I think this is fairly obvious to anybody who lives here, and this is not just a concept that you can apply in America. This concept can be applied around the world, where you have neo-colonial states who have African leaders, but the countries are still in dire straits because capitalism is still capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. All these things are still going. So elite capture helps us understand how when something might seem like it's for the benefit of everybody, it tends to fall in the hands of an elite group of people in any given context. And as we talk about in this discussion later, elite can change and evolve depending on the situation. So elite is not a static term, as we'll get to. So rooting for everybody black is really how something like the myth of trickle-down blackness shows up in the everyday culture. It's the words people use to really describe stuff like trickle-down blackness, as in, if we root for everybody black, that will translate to benefits for everyone. Of course, rooting for everybody black was something that was really said off the cuff by actress Issa Rae, star of Insecure, for those who are living in some other world and don't know who that is. She said that at an awards show. They asked her who she was rooting for in the awards, and she says,
"I'm rooting for everybody black." I am.
And then somehow that became a politic. That became a politic because this idea of black unity and just believing in everybody black across all places at all times permeates. So what we do is we go over several phrases, not just rooting for everybody black. We go over we're all on the same team. We go over all skin folk ain't kinfolk. We go over crabs in a barrel. Phrases that actually show up in our day-to-day that reify this idea that black people, if we all just stick together and root for each other, then we'll all benefit. I think this comes from a good place, and I do think some of this works, when you're talking about rooting for black people in a given context, but across all spaces and all times, it doesn't work. And we're talking about some of these other phrases, we're all on the same team and so on and so forth. These things really depend upon the politic that people take. It's not just an inherent thing that just by doing stuff like people all fall under the same kind of umbrella. Like, that doesn't play out. There's a, as we talk about on this show all the time, there's a class interest that often obscures the ways that we understand so-called blackness or African people. So Femi does a great job of just really philosophically showing how these things work, how these phrases that I think many of us mean well when we say them, we don't, how it still can go wrong, and how elite capture explains how it doesn't necessarily matter if you are intending to do mean things or good things. People who have very good intentions, how things often can become co-opted because there is a social system in place that sets that in motion. And elite capture really helps explain that. So without further ado, we're going to get into this conversation. There'll be 2 parts of this, 3 parts in total of this myth, the myth of trickle-down blackness, but we're entitling this episode and probably the next one, rooting for everybody black, because we really want to deal with language, as we did last month when we talked to Dr. Yannick Marshall, and we went through a whole 15 terms. We're not doing that many terms this time, but we're going to go over things in a more philosophical way. Then, the next few months, we're going to get back more into deeper dives into data and such. But anyway, get into this discussion, and I would encourage people to cop the book. All right. All right. So we are back with Femi Taiwo, professor at Georgetown University, as you heard in the intro. I know you teach philosophy, but what specifically do you teach at Georgetown?
So I teach social and political philosophy. So a lot of times there'll be intro to ethics, but also I've taught intro to Black radical thought, graduate seminar on colonialism, and undergraduate classes on reparations.
Okay. So do you teach the reparations class around your book, or?
I usually don't. I brought the book up once, but it's just weird having students read your work, so
Mm.
I don't do it anymore. But
So you're not one of those people that gets book sales every semester by making them buy your book. you, you ain't got to answer that, but I had a few of those, so I remember those days. Um, yeah. So you did. So you put out 2 books this year. I think that's a great feat. Most of us will be lucky to put out one in a lifetime. So you put out 2 books this year. So the one, do you want to talk about those projects just a little bit, just to give people a backdrop, and then we'll get more into the conversation. Particularly the first book, because we're going to be highlighting the Elite Capture book, but I do want people to know more about the book on reparations, just so they can go cop that.
yeah, so just a little bit about it. It's called Reconsidering Reparations, and it tries to say what makes reparations for transatlantic slavery and colonialism different and kind of distinctive from just any particular event that you could want reparations for or have a reparations movement in response to, is that transatlantic slavery and colonialism built the world. So
Mm-hmm.
I argue, and I go through a bunch of history and social science, Walter Rodney and Eric Williams and all those people who have made that argument. And then I say, look, if these events built the world, and they're not just any old injustices, but the injustices that built the world, then we should want a reparations that rebuilds the world,
Mm-hmm.
this time in a just way instead of a systematically unjust way. So on an argumentative level, that's what the book argues for. And then it says, by the way, if you thought that it was an actual kind of construction project of rebuilding the world, from a practical perspective, that means it's going to have to confront climate change and climate injustice, which are things that are rebuilding the world now, but in the wrong direction.
Right, towards destruction.
So, exactly. So that's what the book goes for.
Okay, yeah, I would definitely encourage people to check that out. I know we talked about it when you were on LDI. But today, you put out the book Elite Capture: How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else. You had appeared on here previously on the Blackness podcast back in, I think, January 2021, and you would just, I think, put out Elite Capture and Identity Politics, the article that was in Boston Review, if I'm correct. And so we had talked about that essay, and I think you had just put out, because I think those came out pretty close, the deference politics, the privilege in the room. I think that it just came out as well, because I know we talked about that essay. So those essays, I don't know how close, but I feel like those came out fairly around the same time, like within a few months of each other or so.
I think they were a few months apart.
Yeah. So we had talked about that, and we talked about the empire has no clothes, and the myth was the myth of trickle down blackness, which is to say that if you concentrate black people at the top, or if you concentrate the success of black people at the top, that success will trickle down to everyone else. And I think, did a great job of exposing that doesn't actually happen. But for those who didn't hear that episode, can you kind of just give us a clarification on like elite capture, and also like you've obviously learned more since you wrote the book. So if there's any new insights you have on that as well, could you just break down like elite capture? And I think the question would be like, what process does elite capture as a social system emerge from as well?
Yeah, so in the book Elite Capture, and in these essays that came out before it, the thing I was trying to say, and I think I try to say even more clearly in the book, elite capture is a system behavior. It's a thing that societies do, and um, things like trickle down blackness, or I think I called it racial Reaganomics. These kind of ideas. I mean, they, as you can tell by how I'm describing them, I don't think very much of them. I think you can criticize them, right? But what I wanted to get away from in the book is thinking is just making the phenomenon, hey, black people who have money are bad in this way and that way,
Right,
and
right,
that's
right.
why there's elite capture. That's not the thing. That's not the analysis I'm going for, right? So what elite capture is it's not a conspiracy. It's not the sole fault of people who are elites, but elite capture is a thing that happens when a society is more responsive to the people at the top of various hierarchies that is to the total group. That's a thing that's going to happen in most, maybe all societies, at least all societies this side of a very serious revolution, right?
Mm-hmm.
If there's inequality, by definition, that means that some people control more
Right.
resources, more things than other people. And it's hard to, make a social system perfectly equally responsive to everybody, but things can be better or worse, right? I've been telling people, think of it like a thermometer rather than on and off switch, right? Elite
Mm-hmm.
capture is going to be really high. Things are going to be really hot as far as elite capture goes when there's more inequality and when the organizations or practices that exist to kind of constrain the effect of inequality are weaker.
Right.
So if you have bigger wealth inequality, for example, there's going to be worse elite capture. Or if you have, the same level of wealth inequality but weaker unions and weaker, regulations, those kinds of things, then you're going to have more elite capture. But all of that is systemic. It's how does the world respond to different people at different places in the social hierarchy.
Yeah. So I think you said, and you just said it in your response, but I just want to read the quote. You said, "Elite capture is not a conspiracy. It's bigger than cynical appropriations, opportunism, or the moral success or failures of any individual or group. It is kind of a system behavior phenomenon articulated at the population level, an observable, predictable pattern of actions involving groups, individuals, subgroups, each of whom may be pursuing any number of different goals from their own narrow point of view." So I think the thing that I want to make sure we clarify, even though you said, I just want to make sure we clarify early on, we're not saying, or you're not saying more particularly, that there's there's a cabal of people who are constantly controlling everybody's behavior directly. Now, there may be, obviously, the social system kind of influences the directions that people go, but it's not a direct line where I'm in my building with all my Illuminati friends, and then then somewhere out the ground I can make this person behave this way directly. Like that that's honestly, I would say, too easy of an explanation. I think if that was the case, I think what you're saying honestly is worse. I think if it was the case that it was just some guys in the building, well, then we could just blow up the building or something and that would be the end of it. You know?
Yeah,
but but
yeah,
yeah, but it's just not that easy. And I think sometimes it's easy to fall into that trap and we go trying to find that building, or even as you talk about in the book, that room where everybody's making those choices. And then that's, if you can just transfer, that's, I think that even when you talk about deference politics, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I think that's where the idea is, if it is a conspiracy, then it would make sense that if you could just transform the room, then we would be good. If it was that direct one-to-one, like from the top of the building to the street, if that was it, then we would be good. Um, so so since it's not that simple, what makes somebody elite, and is everybody elite, or what makes somebody elite, and is it elite the same thing in all contexts and places?
yeah. So um, the way that I use elite basically just means relative advantage.
Mm-hmm.
So it means you're comparing a person to the rest of the people in some kind of group. And that definitely means that different people are elites in different contexts, or, another way to say it would be people are elites compared to different other people. So there are some people maybe Bill Gates is an elite in any room that he could walk in,
Right.
right?
Right.
So we could just say Bill Gates is an elite, and we don't have to engage in any of these complications because we know whatever we're comparing him to, he's going to be towards the top, if not the top. But there's these other, for most people, it's somewhere in the middle, right? So I usually use myself, right? If we're talking about on the scale of living conditions and wealth and social power of Black people, I am a 1%er, right?
Right.
There's a lot of Black folks are in much different economic and political situations than I'm in. But if we're looking at Georgetown tenure track faculty, I'm an assistant professor and there are people that outrank me or whatever.
Right.
So if we're talking about the second group, then maybe I'm not an elite, at least if we're talking about rank or something. And what I'm getting at, the reason why I want a definition that moves like that is because, one of the things I was trying to explain in being in the room privilege, that second essay that came out about deference politics, is that you go into academic rooms, academic spaces, and you meet a lot of people who really are, maybe in an absolute sense or maybe relative to the kinds of people they're interacting with now, they're disadvantaged, right? A lot of people who are, people of color, a lot of people who are women or non-binary in these academic spaces, and they're looking at, Todd Codrington III, whose parents teach at Harvard or whatever, and they're like, yeah, that guy,
Right.
those people in academia are more advantaged than me, and so like here, I'm a disadvantaged person in some way. Um, but the point I'm making in being in the room privilege is, well, compared to them, you're not an elite, but compared to, the total group of people of color on this planet, for example, maybe you are, and those are the things that we don't always necessarily think about, but are important if we're trying to explain why politics is moving in the way that it is.
Right. So it's not the way I always understood it. It's not like a static position. Um, like in the book, you talk about how E. Franklin Fraser referred to the black bourgeoisie, for instance, as the lumpen, bourgeoisie, which is just a funny term. but 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 for those who don't know, lumpen, within like there's lumpen proletariat, which is supposed to be like even a level below like the proletariat, because the lumpen is people who aren't working. That's the nicest way of saying it. And the proletariat are the workers, right? So the lumpen bourgeoisie, which is again a kind of a funny phrase, is to say like the black bourgeoisie overall, like in comparison to other elites, are nothing, right? Like and not just in America, but really like across the world, like they're not really whether we're talking even when we're talking about people who are over states or whatever, that may be over a poor country or something, they're nothing compared to the multinational corporations that usually run them on a neo-colonial level. They're not, they don't rise above white capital at all. But in relationship to their population that they come from, the group that they're racialized into, black African people, they are elite, right? Like, so I just want to make sure people get that distinction. So, because a lot of times this is used as a way to deflect criticism, because it's like, well, like you said, when I'm in the room with Bill Gates, if Jay-Z's in the room with Bill Gates, then he's, it's not, but Jay-Z's still a billionaire, so it's like, in comparison to us, like, he's elite, and he calls himself this, like, he's open about it. I mean, he says it in a song, he's black elite, but it's like, but in comparison to someone else, so it's a relative position, but it seems that hegemony or that hierarchy follows through society, if I'm understanding that correctly, like that it will find a way to position itself, whatever the elite thing is, will find a way to position itself in a given context. And then that's where the interests tend to collapse. Is that a fair understanding of, yeah.
Exactly. And we can craft different spaces, but the problem doesn't disappear. It just changes in terms of who the elite is and, what it means that they're elite, right? Like, in the labor movement, there's a long history of complaining about the so-called labor aristocracy, right? They're not capitalists, right? They don't own the factory, they don't own the business, but somebody who is a long-standing union officer, might have more sway in the union and control more resources than a rank and file union member. Right. So, as we change the group that we're comparing people to, some people who weren't elites in general might become elites in that smaller context. So it's flexible and it shifts.
Right. And I think I just want to make sure we got that part clear, because as we talk through some of this other stuff, that needs to be understood, that this isn't a static position. So this episode, again, is the myth technically is the myth of trickle-down blackness part 2, but the myth we're really going to focus on today is this idea of rooting for everybody black, and then all the subsequent phrases that preceded it or just are used among black folks that tend to erase class from the conversation totally. But to your point, when people say they're rooting for everybody black or anything, when people say these things, it's not about a good or bad intention necessarily. Like, I think in most cases, I think when you say something like that, you mean well. Like, I mean, you're literally saying you're rooting for everybody black. So we're not attacking folks who say this phrase, but we're trying to understand how phrases like this, as well as other phrases, like I already stated them in the intro, but we're all on the same team, all skin folk ain't kinfolk, and crabs in a barrel, how these phrases tend to kind of, minimize class and also just the way that elite interests can take over. But we want to understand, how does that happen? So how does something as ubiquitous as I'm rooting for everybody black, which was said by, Issa Rae at an awards show, how does that phrase become a politic? And then how does that phrase become very much interested in rooting for celebrities who are black versus, the kind of general way that everybody black, quote unquote, works. So question, even before we get to the deeper politics, do you root for everybody black?
No, I don't root for everybody black.
Why do you not root for everybody?
The interesting thing is that nobody does. Like, people agree to that phrase, and then they hop on Twitter and it's the diaspora wars, or it's the gender wars, or it's the whatever, but that energy doesn't last more than a couple tweets for most folk, as far as I can tell. Which is fine. I don't think gender or diaspora are the dividing lines that we should be using.
Right.
But I do agree that we shouldn't be rooting for everybody black, because not everybody black is rooting for you, and not everybody black wants things that we should build into how the world works.
Right. I think when that phrase was said, again, it was said at an award show, and they were asking her who she was rooting for the awards. So who do you want? I think it was at the Emmys. Who do you want to win tonight at the awards show? I'm rooting for everybody black. And I think a lot of black people can relate to watching Jeopardy and there's a random black guy, so you want the black guy to win, or whatever kind of game show, and I want the black person to win because who gives a shit, like, I'm just watching the show.
Right.
Like, it's yeah.
And that's totally fine with me, right? We're watching the boxing world championship and it's Jack Johnson, some white dude, that's fine, right? Like, starting from an assumption of solidarity until you're given a reason not to be in solidarity with somebody. I think that's a great idea. And I think that's actually what most people seem to mean. And I think that's good, right? So it's not, I think what it's actually saying is good. I think taken literally, it's bad.
Right. Like, if as an offhand statement at an awards show, it's fine because there's a context there. But exactly. To the point about elite capture, it's things aren't static, so it changes depending on. So you take that phrase and you throw it in an election, you know, where
Right.
Kamala Harris is the vice president, you know, or, you know, you throw it in, you know, you talked about something that E. Franklin Frazier said. This is under a different heading but I think it's a good quote to bring up now. Uh, he says, I think this, you wrote this, but this is what Franklin was talking about in his book, Elite Capture. The elite in control of prominent black media, he argued, would advance these subgroup interests seemingly without regard for the welfare of the larger group. Frazier gave, as an example, the celebration by a black newspaper on the election of a black doctor to the presidency of a local affiliate of the American Medical Association, even though the doctor had opposed a national health program and the AMA itself opposed socialized medicine. So what matters more, the black doctor becoming the president or, air quote, socialized medicine? You know, people having health care, basically, is all we're talking about. So a custom question is, why will rooting for everybody black ultimately not benefit everybody black equitably? And I want to think about this through the lens of elite capture.
I think the example that Frazier gave is a really good example, right? So I think, you know, I haven't looked into this particular doctor, right? But, you know, a guess about why he opposed socialized medicine is that the American Medical Association of his time opposed quote unquote socialized medicine, right? So that doctor has a decision to make. Is it more important to you what is good for black people, or is it more important to you to like rise professionally by being part of this prestigious association? And, you know, we could explain that decision in a lot of ways. Maybe he thinks, you know, there's never going to be socialized medicine, so why does it matter if I support it? You know, the one thing I can change is I can get into this AMA thing. We don't have to read this person as a villain. All we have to do is notice that that's not the last time that that's going to happen. Right? The interests of, you know, the people, the very most advantaged people within Blackness or within whatever identity group might, you know, in a world that is constructed in an unfair, unjust way, might be different a lot of times than the total interests, you know, the full interests of the whole group, whether it's the whole group of black folks or the whole group of whoever. And so rooting for everybody black, you know, it in situations where the kind of people, you know, the kind of situations where we're thinking about are award shows, the kind of award shows that somebody as accomplished as Issa Rae gets to go to, you know, I think that's not clearly going to benefit all black folk.
Yeah, and I think there was a think piece that came out shortly after she said that, because, you know, we can't just let people say shit without turning it into a politic. Because, you know, it's interesting just seeing the social dynamics of all of these things. So like that gets said, and then the right is like, oh, this is racist, and then some of us feel the need to defend it, and then it becomes a politic because we're responding to some accusation of it's racist to root for everybody black, and then it becomes a rallying cry or something, when it really was just an offhand statement. And then, like you said, it's somebody who is at an award show that most of us will never attend. The best we get to do is watch it. You know, we're not gonna, we're not gonna be able to. Most of us will never win any of these awards or be in the room with these kinds of people. But that becomes a statement of how we understand, you know, everything. So I think like when I read that article, the person, I can't remember, I won't even say it if I could, but the person who wrote that piece was like, when they win, it benefits all of us. So when black people do win at the whatever place, the Oscars, the Emmys, that is a reflection on all of us, which I think you talk about in the book, you know, the kind of racial uplift, ideology of, you know, which goes to the myth of the trickle-down blackness, like the elites do something,
Exactly.
and then that, you know, comes down to all of us. But then that does become, I think we talked about when we talked about this in the first one, that there is a trickle down effect in the values, even if there's not a trickle down effect in the actual like material success, right? There is a trickle down effect in the values. So how are our desires for success intertwined with elite capture?
So, when I was thinking about this, there's a colleague of mine, a philosopher named Teen Wen, who talked about this thing called value capture.
Mm-hmm.
So what he says is value capture is a kind of process that happens, um, that is kind of like how games work, right? In games, you have spaces for action, and you usually have really clear markers of success, right? How do you win basketball? Well, you score more points than the other team.
Right.
We measure how many points you've scored. There's a scoreboard. We can keep track.
Right.
It's simple.
Clear,
Actually
clear,
winning is hard,
yeah.
but
It's a clear, deliberate outcome.
But it's clear what you have to do.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the outside of games, the social world is complicated. What do we all need? We all need dignity and self-respect, right? We need prestige and honor, but we also need, healthcare and food and shelter.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who are disadvantaged in a group, especially a marginalized group, especially Black folks, have all of those problems. Black folks are disrespected disproportionately. Black folks are, kept away from prestigious social jobs and positions and roles. Black folks are disproportionately houseless or in substandard housing. Black folks are disproportionately unemployed, right? All those problems, all of them. But the people, the Black elites, have fewer of those problems,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it's definitely, it's still true that Black people in positions like mine aren't as respected as other folks. But a lot of this other stuff, my rent gets paid every month on time.
Right.
And so I have a simpler version of the total group's social problems. And what happens is over time, you combine that with elite capture and inequality. You combine that with the fact that a lot more people hear what Issa Rae has to say about Blackness than most Black workers because of the nature of her fame and influence,
Right.
because she's an accomplished person, right? Over time, the kinds of conversations we can have in public about Blackness start to move towards those kinds of representation-based ways of talking about racism. And I think that's the problem. Some people internalize that and really internalize the values that come with that. Some people are more cynical about it. They think, okay, well, this is just how the game is played, so this is how I'm going to talk to get advantages. Some people are more in the middle. They're like, I'm not really sure what's true, but I know that this is what people are talking about, so maybe this is what I should talk about.
Right.
The psychological story is going to be different for different people.
Right.
But over time, that's where the whole social conversation is going to go.
Yeah, it's like I was saying with the Issa Rae statement, or you see this happen damn near all the time. That becomes the conversation. It's not really about whether we agree. It's just the conversation. so even if you and I, who clearly aren't on that bandwagon, jump in the conversation, it's still something we have to respond to. Even if we're like, it's elite capture, right? Like it's still,
right.
We're still part of that conversation. We're still talking about these people because they automatically, based on their position in society, pull the attention. You talk about the attention economy too. Like they grab the attention of the people in a way that if somebody at Amazon is just clocking in whatever says I'm rooting for everybody black, there's not a national response because you said it to people at your job. There's not a camera in front of you. There's nothing that's gonna make all of us come to your defense. We don't even know what happened, like quite literally,
Right.
you know. So even whether we disagree, agree, that's the thing I think people miss is that happened in a certain context. So when it happens, it's in front of millions of people, you know, like so. I think so. To your point, it's not that every black person believes that or doesn't, or it, in some cases, if it, whether it even matters. It's
Right.
that
Yeah.
it becomes something that we have to contend with, and because the people that are elite, again, they're not even intending. Again, I keep saying she said. I think she's a comedian. Like she was just talking, you know,
Yeah.
and then it becomes a thing.
Yeah. She was talking in the room and in the context she was in. She wasn't trying to tell everybody, "Hey, develop this as your politics." She was just answering a question about what she was doing that day.
Yeah, and I think that's the part that I think people miss is they'll jump to defend her, but it's like the context of all of that's just, it's almost scary to think of like somebody can say something like that and that becomes a conversation. Somebody gets smacked at the Oscars and all of a sudden that's the thing that we have to talk about. And even if we're annoyed seeing it, it's like you were saying, some people are like, okay, I believe this. Some people are like, okay, I don't believe this, but this is what I need to play into because there are incentives tied to it, right? Like there's material interest tied to it. And that will ultimately over time because those people occupy these spaces over and over and over time that will influence the general conversation, particularly now I would say even more than in Fraser's time because the media apparatus is just so broad, you know, like the way to communicate your message is so much broader than it would have been in, you know, what year was that book written in? I think 1951 or something like that. Like it's just yeah, like you couldn't. Things were way more regional back then, so something that happened in Alabama was just in Alabama. It did you couldn't like post about it. You know what I mean? Like, you know, it might get in a newspaper and make its way up north or somewhere else, but you couldn't immediately go online and make a post and then everybody can see it. Or there's a camera that's right there to share it everywhere. It doesn't mean media wasn't influential back then. It just didn't have the same effect. Um, but I think when people hear this, they'll say, okay, so should we, since we know that's a thing, let's say they accept your premise that elite capture is a thing, and value capture is also a thing, that yes, their values tend to take over the conversation. So should we, can we eliminate elite capture by centering the most vulnerable black people? I think that's been a almost implicit response. Like, okay, we need to, if we are elite, we need to center the most vulnerable, whatever that means, the most marginalized people. So that's the question. Can we eliminate elite capture by centering the most vulnerable black people?
I've been, ever since I wrote that second essay, I've been trying to think about this. Um, because I actually say I kind of talk around this. The thing that I say in the essay in the book is, you know, I don't know what we could get done by centering different people. I just do know that, the black elite people who use this word centering aren't doing that.
Mm.
You know, the what people do instead is they say, well, this category of person, um, based on, race or gender or sexuality or some combination of these, like this is the right category to listen to. But if you actually meant the most vulnerable, you wouldn't have to look through categories. You could look through people's, actual circumstances.
Their conditions, yeah, yeah.
And it's exactly. And, and that would be a very different thing than anything I've ever seen in academia or, whatever, under the heading of centering, right? Or things I see most often. That's the fairer thing to say. But I think at the end of the day, there is a question about who should have political leadership of a movement, and who we should be primarily accountable to in a movement. And if that's what people mean by centering, then I feel like I'm on board. But even if we, even if we did that, even if we were maximally accountable to, people who are unhoused or people who are in the most precarious of the parts of the carceral system or whatever it might be, the thing we would have to do in any of those cases are get people housed in destroyed prisons.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the centering question is a good question to ask about how to do those things, but it's not a question that replaces doing those things. And that's what I'm more worried about.
Yeah, I guess you said they're not centering. What I'm being a little facetious, but I also am asking a somewhat honest question. What do people mean by centering? Like, what exactly does that mean? Like, because I think it's just assumed that there's a universal way to center people, and I don't know, like, what does that actually mean? We're saying we're centering the most vulnerable, we're centering whatever the group of people is, even if it was static. Like, what would that even mean?
I I feel like people most often, I usually interpret people to be talking about kind of attention. Like, so the way that we should explain the part of the world that we're trying to contest or change should be starting from how it is experienced by, um, you know, undocumented people or
Right.
Black women or Black men or
Right.
whatever the group might be that folks are saying should be centered. And again, I don't have. We should do that, but I've I feel like people are people are willing to burn the bridges that you would need to keep intact to actually, you know, change the world on the basis of whatever analysis we're building in favor of, like, you know arguing about who the analysis should center. That just
Right.
doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I think I don't I don't know if you make this I don't remember if you make this point in the book, but I think there's an odd way that elite capture I think plays into even this process where once you know that a group is being centered and then that's tied to certain resources, there's a fight to like be the center of whatever that is. Like to make your group that center, So they're gonna give grants to this, we want more queer Black women in leadership. All right, like how do we find a way? Like I think there is. I'm not saying everybody's doing it in a evil way or something, but I think there is a way that disciplines people to try to like force this narrative that they're the center. And then like you were talking earlier about diaspora wars and gender wars. I think a lot of that. I'm not getting into the fights of it, but I think a lot of that is based on this fight for whatever the center is, whatever, not the center like in a political spectrum, but like the most oppressed, the most marginalized, and trying to fight that your group is at the bottom. I think there's a real fight for that. I think you talked about this in when you were on Millennials and Killing Capitalism. Like, once we win, or once the argument is resolved on who's at the bottom, we still have problems to deal with. But there's this race to the bottom, I think, because to your point about how there's still material consequences of these things, there's a sense of, if I can put my group in, like, this benefits for me. Even if it is very like self-centered, it's still like, even on an individual level, like, if I can prove that Black, straight cis men are the most oppressed, then I can prove that, all the grants need to come to me. I mean, we've both filled out grant applications where it's literally like incentives to tell people how oppressed you are individually. Like, it's like, are you disabled? Are you Black? Are you, like, and I mean, I filled out grants. There's one here locally. I won't speak on the name of it, where I think I didn't win it one year because I didn't play into that. Like I needed to say more of how hard my life has been because it's about this like break for artists or something. So if I say it's been hard, then I'll like, man, we need to give him the grant. Like there's so many incentives tied to saying I have been treated worse than anyone else, right? So I don't know. I mean, I don't really have a question on that. I guess just thinking about that idea, if you could just respond to that.
I think that's really important because, that's also part of why I want to resist the whole cynical, it's just people being evil or
Mm-hmm.
unthoughtful explanation of elite capture. Because exactly like you're saying, there's real meaningful material incentives for a group of people to play into these kinds of wars, right? If it's the difference between getting a grant or not, if it's the difference between getting one of the handful of tenure track faculty lines there
Mm-hmm.
are to teach at university and not, that's really meaningful at the level of a person who's trying to eat, who's trying to support their family, and it makes
Right.
sense why if you were in that position you would, you know the, those questions would become important to you in a way that wasn't just, an intellectual exercise of like
Right.
what's the answer to this abstract question of who's the most oppressed. It's, that question becomes tied to incentives, it becomes tied to survival, and the elite capture comes in partially just because of that whole scenario we just talked about, right? For for most people, it isn't true, right? Most people don't eat or not eat on the basis of these particular grants or tenure track lines. You know,
Right.
these aren't, these aren't the the determining factor for the material lives of most Black folks. And so these questions that are trickling down to the culture in the wrong way, I think, that
Yeah.
are really meaningful for a particular set of people are being driven by material factors that don't apply to most of the people that are being talked about in these wars.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're right. Most people don't apply to a job, just a minimal job. They don't apply to a job and play that up because there's no incentive to do it. I'm saying if I'm applying to work at, again, a minimal job, like let's just think of the worst kind of job, like a Walmart or something. I mean, you are the most marginalized if you work at Walmart anyway. But I'm just saying, like, if you apply to Walmart, there's no incentive to be like, well, I've came from poverty, even though you might have because you're at Walmart, or Walmart might put
Right.
you in poverty if you're not already there. So it's just like, but you don't play that
They'll
up.
be like, we know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like there's no incentive.
That's why we're not paying you good money.
Yeah, but when in an
Yeah.
academic space or in people who are trying to leverage this stuff in other rooms, then it is like, well, I came from a mother that worked at Walmart, which is it could be a very real thing, but you're trying to use because there's a grant tied to that, right? Or I came from, like, I mean, even in admissions, that's how this stuff is built, and then more and more it's built on, what are the points of you came from this and you came from that, and this is what people, the right complains about. It's not meritocracy. That's bullshit. But I'm just saying, like, that is built in. The higher you go, it seems more and more that has kind of been baked in. I don't think it was always that as bad as it is today. But the response to kind of social movements, the elite response has been to build things in that way, and I think it's having a bad impact because, like you said, people burn bridges, types of solidarity that could be had get lost because you're not recognizing that I am this most oppressed group, and it does become a form of identity to people beyond just the material thing. But I think the material thing is what is influencing whatever other kind of identity that it ultimately becomes. Because even beyond like just getting money or like those kind of things, there's a certain level of social acceptance that comes with this, right? Like if you can prove that you're that. I'm talking about in certain spaces there's a certain level of like, oh, everybody's going to be nice to me now, you know, or I can yell at all the white people because I'm this, you know, oppressed person, you know, like there's all kinds of different social advantages that come with that too. So moving on to the next term, and I think it relates to this conversation because as much as people will argue for all these like different sub oppressive categories, for lack of a better term, there's also this thing you hear, we're all on the same team. You hear this among, particularly, we're talking about black people. And it essentially is to say, you know, despite the differences we all may have, we're on the same team. And sometimes people will use that phrase in a response to the stuff we were just talking about as well. Like they'll be like, you know, fuck all that, we're all black. You know, at the end of the day, we're all black. So you might be this, that, or this, but we're all black, right? And then that means we should all be working towards a collective goal because we're all black. We're all in the same team. You know, Jay-Z, this is kind of what inspired some of these questions in Murder to Excellence. You know, he literally says this in a lyric, like, you know, when you
everything, nigga, you know my fresh coat. My fighting for you, don't increase my stress though. Niggas watching Stone, very happy to be you. Power to the people. When you see me,
like I'm black, you're black, we're all in the same team. You know, like he said, don't increase my stress load. We're all, because you know he's trying to climb the ladder and he's doing it for you. This is the pitch that he's making. So, like, first of all, like, who is we? That people mean when they say this, and what is the team that people are talking about? I want to make sure we like just flesh this part out first.
Yeah, I think, you know, again, you know, there's the thing it says literally, and then there's the thing that, you know, maybe it actually says, you know, the more careful version, right? So just looking at it literally, it feels like it implies, you know, black people have the same interests, or at least their interests, you know, coincide, they overlap. Maybe the more careful version of that is that, you know, black interests are linked. So, you know, whatever your interests are as a black person, if things go worse for other black people somewhere else, then things necessarily go worse for you. So the black doctors, you know, going to be less likely to succeed if things go worse for black patients. And if we're thinking of people's interests in kind of individual, you know, neoliberal terms or whatever, like just me and my pockets, that way of looking at the individual, it just isn't true.
Right.
Jay-Z might well get richer and more respected while black working class people, you know, have higher levels of unemployment and eviction and all that. That's entirely possible. So I think we are all on the same team. To me, that's kind of less that's less description and more aspiration. Like, if I were to say something like that as a Pan-Africanist, you know, what I would be saying is, no, you should think of yourself as, you know, we should make it true by adopting a certain kind of politics that we're invested in what's happening to all black people, right? So you, as a black working class person, having, you know, getting evicted is worse for me, not because it shows up in my bank account, but because I'm invested in what happens to you. Right. Like that's what it should be. And I think, you know, I think sometimes that's what people mean by it. And if that's what they mean, then I'm on board. But we have to build that. It's not there already.
Yeah, I think that statement is, it depends on who's saying it. That's where the, you know, the messenger matters, because sometimes it's said in a cynical kind of like, you know, we're on the same team, don't criticize me kind of thing, you know, particularly from elites, like we're on the same team. That's kind of what Jay-Z was saying, unfortunately. You know, and then in other cases, people really do mean that, but I think like you said, it's an aspiration regardless. So it's a politic that we want to build that kind of politic because we think, especially as Pan-Africanists, like that's something that ultimately, you know, in the final analysis, we're saying will be the best outcome if we approach it like that. But the interests from society are not assigned in the same way as the politic we may be attempting to bring into the real world, right? So your interests, in many ways, you kind of have to subvert those interests if you're going to be on the same team. And I think this is where the contradiction aligns. So it's like, if I'm on the same team as someone else, if I'm a celebrity or a black celebrity, and I'm saying, well, I'm on the same team as black people, then I need to recognize where I'm at. And this isn't about centering and all that shit. It's just recognizing, like, I hold a certain class position, so my politics need to reflect the politic that actually benefits that team, not just because I'm black and I'm here and I do things that I think are good for black people, but I don't really state my explicit politic or line. That's just going to naturally make its way. And that's where the myth of it trickling down, you know, comes from. Because it's not about trickling anything down in the first place. That really shouldn't be the goal. Because it's like coming back to the centering question. I mean, in some cases, people should just give away all their money, and if you really want to center folks, you know.
Right.
But
yeah.
you know, I'm saying not if you have billions of dollars and you're like still walking around with billions of dollars, you're not centering anybody but yourself because you have billions of dollars. Like, you know, I mean, it's one thing to just have a good job and have money to take care of yourself, but I mean, like, to have that much money, I don't know. But so with that being said, I kind of answered this myself. Are we all on the same team with the same interests?
We're not, but we could be.
Okay.
You know, I think we can take the team sports metaphor literally, right? You know, I feel like everybody's played basketball with the person who wasn't even really trying to win, but just, you know, the guy who goes around, you know, shoot or shoot or whatever.
Yeah, just gunning. Yeah.
And like, that's not the person you want on your team, right? And if you were playing for anything that mattered, that would be important, right? If you were playing for a ring, you know, someone would be like, oh, it's actually not just how many points I score. It's actually whether we win or not, right? As a team. And that's just built into the activity, right? It's built into the, you know, on the scoreboard. It doesn't say, here's how many points LeBron has, and then here's how many points the other team has. It says, here are the points the teams have. And so I think one of the things that organization does, you know, whether it's unions or party politics, it creates a real structure in the way that team sports create real structures, where, you know, there's still individuals within that, but you have a reason, there's a thing that you can keep track of to say, like, here's how the collective is doing, and I can pay attention to whether or not I'm fitting into that, whether or not I'm helping that, and how good we're doing.
Right. And it's like, there are, you know, using the basketball analogy, there are clearly players who are going to have more points than the other player. Everybody's not going to, if we score 100 points and there's 5 of us play, you know, everybody's not going to score 20 points, right? Like, you know, there's going to be somebody that probably has 30 something, you know, if it's only 5 of us playing, and it's probably going to be somebody with 40, honestly. That's what I'm saying. Like, there's going to be somebody who gets more points. That's, you know, that's the nature of the game. And in the case we're talking about, if we come back to real world, we're talking about capitalism. The nature of the game is, again, like you're saying, it's built into it. So elite capture, some people are going to be more successful with this. That's just the nature of having classes in general. Like, the classes are structured in that way. That's, you know, so some people are going to make more money. Some people are going to, you know, be more successful within the kind of general standards of what success is measured as. But if you're on the same team, even with the, you know, there are players who could score 40 points a game. They understand that's not what's best for the team. You know, like they like, you know, I'm not going to play faves or anything. I'm just saying like somebody like LeBron or anything else. Like LeBron easily, especially at the height of his career, could have probably averaged 40 points a game. I don't know if his team would have won a lot, but he could have done it, you know. So, but it's just understood that when everybody's going, when everybody's touching the ball, you know, when you watch the Warriors play at their best, like this is a sense of like that's what's going to help us win. When people are just jacking up shots, it throws off the chemistry and the rhythm of the team. But when somebody's doing that and then says somebody is jacking up shots, or somebody is hogging the ball, or somebody's not playing team ball, which I think is generally how this plays out, because most people don't even actually move like they're on the team, other than maybe their class. You can't then turn around and say we're all on the same team, you know. And even in sports, like there's a union in the NBA. Like that's why there's a floor where everybody's making like $1 million and it goes up from there. You know, they could structure it where LeBron gets, you know, 400 million and then you come along, you get 50,000, but there's no incentive to play, you know, if that's the, you know, so the union is talking about organizations come together and say, hey, let's make sure, there's going to be disparities in pay, but let's make sure everybody is taken care of overall. Like, I think, again, that's not a perfect model, but I'm just saying, like, that's better, I think, than what we have, you know?
Exactly. And, you know, that, I think that's the work of the next few years, to try to make that thing, you know, even if it's a imperfect model, as long as it's an improvement on what we have now, which is, you know, everybody as a free agent.
Yeah, and it's like, and only time you play into the team thing is, again, often is when there's material tied to it, like material success. Like that's, again, I think that's how it's being disciplined. I don't think everybody's a bad person for it, but I think it's being disciplined that way. All right, so that's the end of this particular episode. Again, to restate it once more, the overall myth is the myth of trickle-down blackness, which the definition has been stated. That's to concentrate Black people in elite spaces at the top and hope that trickles down to the liberation of everyone else, and that does not happen. That's clear. But today we're dealing with the phrases, so rooting for everybody Black is the conceptual way that we're looking through things, as well as the other phrases. So there's 2 more phrases left. There's all skin folk ain't kinfolk, and then there's crabs in a barrel, or a so-called crab mentality that we're going to deal with, as well as I think a great conversation on class suicide, and if that is a way to somewhat combat this idea of elite capture within the Black African world. So tune in for that. Thank you, everybody who listened. Thank you for all the patrons. We'll see y'all next week. What we will probably do, I do want to say this for people who are on the Patreon, when we have just an interview that we break down in 2 parts, we'll put out the full interview on the Patreon for those who are subscribers. So if you want to hear the full interview, we'll put that on Patreon. You don't have to wait an extra week. When we have episodes that are split, can't guarantee that, but for stuff like this, we can do that. So check that out. Peace out. Thank you.
Okay, fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.